I want to start tonight with something that happened 53 years ago. I think it is the single most useful lens for understanding what just happened in the last 24 hours. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Arab members of OPEC did something that had never been done before at that scale. They weaponized oil, they turned the taps off, they said to the United States and to Britain and to Canada and to Japan, you are supporting Israel in this war and we are cutting you off. And the price of oil nearly quadrupled. It went from about $3 a barrel to almost $12 a barrel in a matter of months, and it sent the entire Western world into an economic tailspin. Gas lines stretching around the block, inflation through the roof, a recession that lasted years. In 1973, the oil weapon was a tap. It was a valve. You could turn it off and you could turn it back on, and when the politics changed, when the negotiations happened, they turned it back on, the oil flowed again, the crisis ended. What happened in the last 24 hours is not a tap, it is not a valve. What happened is that critical energy infrastructure, the actual physical plants that process and liquefy and export natural gas to the entire world, those facilities have been bombed. They have been physically destroyed. And here is the part that should keep you up at night. You cannot turn a destroyed LNG plant back on. You cannot flip a switch. You cannot sign a ceasefire and have the gas flowing again by Tuesday. The damage that has been done in the last 24 hours will take 3 to 5 years to repair, and that means the economic pain that started today, the price spike that started today, is not going away when this war ends. It is baked in for years. So let me take you through what happened and why it matters. It has now been 20 days since this war began on February 28th, and in those 20 days we have watched it escalate from targeted military strikes to something that is now reshaping the global economy in real time. The latest escalation starts with a decision by Israel to strike the Asaluye complex in southern Iran, and specifically to damage facilities connected to something called the South Pars gas field. Now, if you haven't heard of South Pars before today, you are about to hear about it a lot, because it is one of the most strategically important pieces of energy infrastructure on the planet. South Pars sits in the Persian Gulf. It is shared by Iran and Qatar, and it is the largest natural gas field in the world. When I say largest, I mean it contains enough recoverable gas to meet global demand for over a decade. Iran draws about 34% of its total gas production from this field. It is the beating heart of the Iranian energy economy. And Iran had warned publicly and repeatedly, if anyone touched its energy infrastructure, if anyone targeted its oil and gas facilities, Iran would not just retaliate against the attacker, Iran would set the entire Gulf on fire. Iran would go after energy infrastructure across the region, and everyone heard that warning. The United States heard it, Israel heard it, the Gulf states heard it, everyone heard it. And then Israel bombed South Pars anyway. Israeli strikes hit the Asaluye complex on March 18th, damaging 4 processing plants, knocking out roughly 12% of Iran's gas production capacity. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held a press conference and said, and I want you to listen to the precise diplomatic language here, he said, fact number 1, Israel acted alone against the South Pars gas compound. Fact number 2, President Trump asked us to hold off on future attacks, and we are holding off. Now hold that thought, because we are going to come back to that very carefully worded statement. Here's why that matters so much. Here's why the South Pars strike changes everything about this war. Before this strike, there was still a world in which this conflict could end with a ceasefire, with negotiations, with some kind of diplomatic off-ramp where trade normalizes and markets stabilize and everyone goes back to buying and selling energy the way they did before February 28th. After this strike, that world is gone because Iran did exactly what it said it would do. Within hours of the South Pars attack, Iran launched retaliatory strikes across the Persian Gulf. Not against Israel, not ag. Against military targets, against energy infrastructure, against the economic lifeblood of its own neighbors. Here is what Iran hit, and I need you to follow the geography here because the scope of this is staggering. Qatar, the Ras Laffan industrial city, home to the largest liquefied natural gas export facility in the world, a facility that produces roughly 20% of all the LNG on the global market. Iranian missiles caused what Qatar Energy's CEO called extensive damage. 2 LNG processing trains and a gas-to-liquids facility were knocked out. 17% of Qatar's total LNG export capacity gone, and the CEO said repairs will take 3 to 5 years. Saudi Arabia, the SAMREF refinery in the Red Sea port city of Yanbu was hit. The Jubail petrochemical complex complex was targeted. The United Arab Emirates, the Al Hosn gas field was struck. Missiles were fired toward Abu Dhabi. Kuwait, 2 gas processing units were targeted. In the span of 24 hours, Iran attacked energy facilities in 4 separate Gulf countries. And Iran's stated justification was this: after the aggression against South Pars, any energy facility in the region with American shareholders or American connections is now a legitimate target. And here is where 1973 stops being a useful comparison and starts being a quaint memory, because in 1973, OPEC chose to withhold oil as a political tool and then chose to release it again when the politics shifted. What Iran has done is not withhold anything. Iran has physically destroyed infrastructure that cannot be rebuilt. LT quickly. This is not a negotiating tactic you can reverse with a phone call. This is structural damage to the global energy supply that will persist for years, regardless of what happens in the war. So why am I telling you this? Why does this matter to you, to your family, to your gas bill, to the price of food at the grocery store? Let's start with Europe. European natural gas benchmark prices surged by 35% in a single day after the Ras Laffan attack. 35% in one day, and overall, European gas prices have now jumped by 60% since the war began 3 weeks ago. 60%. Europe was already dealing with energy price anxiety after the disruption of Russian gas supplies. They had shifted to rely more heavily on LNG imports, a significant portion of which came from Qatar. And now that supply has been physically destroyed. Now let's talk about India, because India is where the human cost of this gets really concrete really fast. India imports 47% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar, nearly half. Nearly half of India's imported gas comes from a facility that is now extensively damaged and will not be fully operational for years. And it's not just about heating homes or powering factories, although it is about that too. LNG is a feedstock for fertilizer production. Fertilizer plants in India are already operating at roughly 70% capacity because of the supply disruption, which means fertilizer gets more expensive, which means farming gets more expensive, which means food gets more expensive. And this is a country of 1.4 billion people. The ripple effect from a missile hitting a gas plant in Qatar reaches all the way to a farmer's field in Uttar Pradesh and to a family's dinner table in Mumbai. The Indian stock market, the Sensex, dropped by 2,400 points in a single day. Roughly 12 lakh crore rupees wiped out, which is around $140 billion in market value evaporated in one trading session, one day. Steel production is being affected because of propane and LPG shortages. And when steel production slows down, you get layoffs, you get delayed construction projects, you get an entire cascade of economic pain that flows from a single geopolitical decision made thousands of miles away. And India is not even in this war. India did not bomb anyone. India did not threaten anyone. India is just a country that buys gas from Qatar, and now India is paying the price. I have to tell you, the thing that is most striking to me about this moment, day 20 of this war, is that every single off-ramp appears to be closing. Let me explain what I mean by that. The pattern over the last 20 days has been this. Fighting escalates, someone floats the idea of negotiations, fighting escalates again, and the negotiations collapse. And each escalation makes the next round of diplomacy harder because the damage is worse, and the anger is deeper, and the trust is more eroded. And now we have this extraordinary public split between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu that is unlike anything we have seen in the 20 days of this war. Here is why T happened. Israel strikes South Pars. Trump goes public and says he knew nothing about the attack. He says the United States had no involvement. He says Israel will not do it again. He is visibly angry. And Netanyahu responds with that very diplomatic statement: Israel acted alone. Trump asked us to stop, and we are stopping. But here is where it gets interesting. 3 Israeli officials told the New York Times that the strike was in fact coordinated with the Trump administration in advance. So either Trump is lying about not knowing, or Israeli officials are lying about coordinating. Or, and this is the possibility that I think deserves the most scrutiny, both things are sort of true in a way that serves both leaders politically. Think about it. Trump needs to appear angry at Netanyahu because the Gulf states are furious, Qatar is furious, Saudi Arabia said trust is gone, the UAE is furious, and these are countries that Trump has been cultivating relationships with. These are countries with enormous sovereign wealth funds and investment relationships with American companies, Trump cannot afford to look like he approved an attack that resulted in their energy infrastructure being bombed by Iran. And Netanyahu needs to appear chastened to say, yes, sir, we are stopping, because that gives Trump cover to tell the Gulf states, look, I reined him in, while also signaling to his domestic audience in Israel that he is willing to take bold unilateral action even when Washington says no. This is not a genuine rift. This is a performance. And the audience for this performance is not you and me. The audience is Riyadh and Doha and Abu Dhabi. And while this performance is playing out, the people who are actually paying for this war, the ordinary people whose fuel costs are rising, whose grocery bills are climbing, whose retirement savings just lost value, those people are not part of the calculation. And speaking of costs, the Pentagon has sent a request to the White House for a supplemental war budget of $200 billion. $200 billion. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was asked about it, and his response was, and I want you to hear this, he said, it takes money to kill bad guys, $200 billion. And that is how the Defense Secretary describes it. To put that in perspective, Fortune magazine calculated that $200 billion would fund the entire United States military for roughly 140 days. And that is just the supplemental, that is on top of the existing defense budget. The war has already cost $12 billion in its first 20 days, and now they want $200 billion more. And here is the part that is not getting enough attention. There are cracks forming even within the Republican Party over this. Behind the scenes, some Republicans have joined Democrats in pressing the administration for details. And GOP leaders have privately acknowledged they may not have the votes to fund this, even within their own caucus. Meanwhile, Europe is walking away. And I mean that almost literally. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz said this war has, and I'm paraphrasing here, nothing to do with NATO, that nay, TO is a defensive alliance, not an interventionist one. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the UK will not be drawn into the wider war. France's President Macron warned that military action outside international law risks undermining global stability, and NATO has actually withdrawn troops from its mission in Iraq, pulling them back to Europe. So when you put those things together, when you stack them up, what you see is this. The United States and Israel are pursuing a war that has now expanded to include the physical destruction of energy infrastructure across an entire region. The economic fallout is being felt from London to Mumbai to Houston. Europe does not want to be part of it. The Gulf states are caught in the crossfire of a war they did not start. The Pentagon wants $200 billion that Congress may not approve. And the two leaders supposedly running this war cannot even agree on whether they coordinated the attack that set off the latest escalation. Hegseth was asked if there's a time frame for this war. He said there is no time frame. Think about that. No time frame. No defined objective for when this ends. No exit criteria, just an open-ended military commitment with an escalating price tag and an expanding blast radius. And Trump himself has acknowledged that more troops may need to be deployed, that American casualties are possible. And if you are old enough to remember, or if you have read your history, that language, more troops, no time frame, possible casualties, that is the language of Vietnam, that is the language of Iraq, that is the language, age of every war that started with a clear objective and ended up lasting a decade. I started tonight with 1973 because I think it is the closest historical parallel to what is happening right now, a Middle East war in which energy becomes a weapon and the entire global economy gets caught in the blast. But here is the difference, and it is a crucial one. In 1973, the damage was political. It was a decision by governments to restrict supply. And when the politics changed, the supply came back in 2026. The damage is physical, it is structural. The Ras Laffan facility will not be producing at full capacity for 3 to 5 years. That is not a prediction. That is Qatar Energy's own assessment. The processing plants at South Pars are damaged. Refineries in Saudi Arabia have been hit. Gas operations across the Gulf have been disrupted. Even if this war ended tomorrow, even if every gun went silent and every missile was grounded and every leader shook hands on the White House lawn, the gas would not flow at full capacity for years. The prices would not come down to pre-war levels for years. The fertilizer shortages in India would not resolve for years. The economic damage is already done and it is compounding. And that is what makes this 20-day-old war different from anything we have seen. It is not just about who wins on the battlefield. It is about what has already been permanently broken in the global energy system. And the people paying for that breakage are not the leaders making the decisions. They are the families in Delhi, wondering why their cooking gas costs more. They They are the factory workers in Germany watching energy costs eat into their employer's bottom line. They are the American taxpayers who are about to be asked for $200 billion with no timeline for when any of this ends. So here is what to watch in the coming days. Watch whether the Gulf states continue to absorb these attacks without retaliating, because Saudi Arabia has already said trust is gone and that these attacks cannot go unanswered. If the Gulf states enter this war actively, it becomes a regional conflagration, unlike anything we have seen in the modern Middle East. Watch whether Congress actually approves the $200 billion supplemental, or whether the bipartisan resistance hardens. Watch whether Europe's refusal to participate holds, or whether rising energy prices force them back to the table. And watch the Trump-Netanyahu dynamic, because if the performance cracks, if the choreography breaks down, if one of them goes off script, the consequences for this war and for the global economy could be enormous. 20 days in, and what started as a targeted military operation has become an economic earthquake, with aftershocks reaching every continent. There is no ceasefire on the horizon. There is no diplomatic framework in place. There is no clear exit strategy. And the infrastructure that the world depends on for energy is burning. This is not 1973. This is worse, because in 1973, you could negotiate the oil back on. In 2026, you cannot rebuild a gas plant with a handshake. We have a lot more to get to tonight. Stay with us.